All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in the fourth of our six-part series of State Tax Policy Bootcamp. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day today. We know how busy everyone is. We know that we're in the midst of legislative sessions. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for those of you who are joining us live, and also those who may be listening or watching at a later date. All of these sessions and the related materials are available at our website at taxfoundation.org/bootcamp. I am Jared Walzak, Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation, but I'm not presenting today. I'm going to be turning over this session to one of my colleagues, Ulrich Boson. Ulrich is an expert on excise taxes, and he's going to speak to you a bit today about both existing and new areas of excise taxation, talking a little about the appropriate design of excise taxes, their proper use, and the different fields in which they are applied. So I hope you will all join us today for the entire session. I hope some of you will ask questions. We do have a Q&A box available at the bottom. You can ask questions at any time, and Ulrich will get to those at the end of his presentation. You can also email those questions to us. If you want to email Ulrich, if you're listening perhaps at a later date, you can email him at uboesen@taxfoundation.org. You can email me at jmw@taxfoundation.org. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ulrich for today's presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I want to echo Jared's comments. We know you guys are all really busy right now, but we're so happy that you're taking the time to join us today. I'm going to talk about excise taxes, and there's a few questions I want to go over today. One is the purpose and the standard structure of excise taxation. We're going to walk through the well-established excise tax categories and some of the concerns that may lay ahead in those. We're going to talk about the longevity of the gas tax. We're going to talk about tobacco taxes, flavor bans, issues surrounding cigarette smuggling, harm reduction. And then we're going to touch on newer trends such as cannabis taxes and sports betting and the like. I also wanted to plug some work that I have coming out later this month. I have a paper on this topic coming out in March, and I hope you would all, if you have an interest, look it up. It's going to be a little bit more detailed than what we'll be able to go through today. Now, to start at the very top, I think it's worth defining the term excise tax. So according to the IRS, an excise tax is a consumption tax that's imposed on the sale of specific goods or services or in certain uses. So by definition, it's narrow by design. It distinguishes itself from broad-based taxes by being on specific goods or services. This narrow design means the lawmakers should be cautious when they rely on them. They're not going to be as stable as your broad-based taxes. Stable revenue should be generated by broader-based taxes. And it's fortunately a development that we are seeing. So historically, excise taxes were just a revenue tool. Products that were normally excised were easy to count. They were measurable. But the reliance on excise taxes has declined dramatically. So if we go back to the first year of federal data in 1934, excise tax revenue made up 46% of the total revenue or total tax revenue raised by the federal government. In 2019, it was only 2.9%. So a significant decline in reliance on these taxes. Today, we rely a lot more on income taxes, for instance. In the states, there's a little bit higher, the figures. So in 2019, again, states collected 7% of their total tax revenue from excise taxes levied on the three big categories: tobacco, alcohol, and motor fuel. Now, excise taxes generally should be levied to internalize negative externalities, sort of a PIGOUVIAN way of thinking about taxation, or to establish a user fee system. As I mentioned before, because they're not broad-based, we shouldn't rely on them for general fund revenues. And the final first point before I move on, these taxes are regressive. If we look at federal excise tax effective rates based on income, that's the chart that I have included on this slide. The top 1% pays a rate that's 9 times lower than the lowest quintile. And it underlines the point that we shouldn't rely on this for our general fund revenue, because we would then be asking those who could least afford it to pay the most. So mentioned before, PIGOUVIAN taxes is one way of looking at excise taxation, named after a British economist, Arthur C. Pigou. It's a tax on a market transaction that creates a negative externality or additional cost. So the idea is that the cost of the retailer, or that you're paying at retail, for instance, doesn't include this additional cost, this side effect that's related to consuming the good or certain activity. Now, if we assume that this is how we want to tax or utilize excise taxes, that we're applying a tax to make up the difference between the market price and the real cost, the excise tax should reflect the real cost or the societal cost. So that means a rate should be roughly equal to the societal cost. Now, this is obviously a lot harder said than done. It's not very easy to calculate the exact cost of a given externality, but a general measurement can be done. Excise taxes are also interesting because they often have an internal tension. So there's often a dual goal when lawmakers impose excise taxes. There's an interest in both reducing consumption and raising revenue. Now, both of these can obviously be achieved to a certain extent. When you increase prices, you're going to lower demand and consumption is going to go down. But you can't maximize for both at the same time. So it's obvious that if we successfully imposed a tax on cigarettes that made everyone quit, there wouldn't be any tax revenue raised from cigarettes. And there's an additional point I think is important when we're talking about excise taxes that are imposed as a deterrent, because the effect is greatest on the occasional user. And what I mean by that is, if we raise excise taxes to deter people from doing certain things, it's going to be the moderate consumers, the occasional users that stop doing it at first. Heavy users will likely keep trying to satisfy their demand or addiction if it's an addictive product. And this may result in some unfortunate unintended consequences, because they may look to both the legal market but also the illegal market to satisfy their demand. Now, that was a little bit about sort of the basic understanding of excise tax, what we use them for. So as I said, these should be applied if there's a negative externality we would like to internalize, or if we want to establish a user fee system. And that determines what kind of tax base we should use, because the tax base should be the best proxy for the negative externality or cost associated with the consumption. So some examples would be tobacco by weight. It's the amount of tobacco that you consume that determines the harm. It could be alcohol by volume. Again, it's the amount of alcohol that you consume that determines the harm. Or motor fuel by volume. It's the amount of motor fuel you consume that works as a proxy for how much you use the roads. And generally, there are two ways that excise taxes are designed. They're either based on quantity, which we call specific, or based on price, which we call ad valorem. Now, quantity is almost always superior to ad valorem, because we're trying to internalize an externality. We're trying to find a proxy for use that's almost always determined by the quantity consumed, not by the price the consumer pays. The next question is setting the rate. As I said before, this is a lot harder to do than it is to say. we may want to have fully efficient taxes that perfectly account for the negative externality or for the use that we're trying to collect the fee for. But it's very difficult in practice. If you wanted to have a fully efficient tax, you would need to account for so many different variables that the tax would be untenable. So simplicity here is the key word. It's not unlike how an insurance company would determine a premium for certain behavior, right? They have to come up with some estimate for the cost associated with a certain kind of behavior, and that's the same kind of thinking we're looking for here, because we're trying to make tax rate correspond to the cost associated with the consumption. It's easier for some categories than for others. Obviously, it's easier to estimate the cost of an average car going an average mile on an average road than it is to account for the difference or for the cost of drinking a glass of wine. Because a thing like alcohol, the harm associated with alcohol is not linear, it's exponential, right? So the first glass someone drinks, they're very unlikely to incur any cost or be the cost of any societal costs. It's not until they become a heavy drinker and they may have 10 glasses of wine that there's a cost associated with it. And how do we account for that in an excise tax system? Well, that's very difficult to do. And likely a simple estimate of the average cost is much better to do than trying to account for all these differences. Taxes should be levied earlier in the value chain. That means at wholesale level, at manufacturing level, because we're trying to limit the amount of taxpayers. It's important because it's going to lower the cost of enforcement, and it's going to make it cheaper for the tax collectors to collect the tax. If you levy a tax at retail level, for instance, you're going to have a much larger number of taxpayers, which could increase your cost and making the tax design less efficient. The revenue should be allocated to cover the cost associated with the tax good or activity. Now, this follows from the whole principle of levying this kind of tax. If we assume there's a negative externality, if we assume there's a cost associated with this kind of behavior, and for that reason we decide to levy a tax, we should make sure that the revenue we collect goes back in to mitigate the cost or to pay for a system that is being utilized. I think a good example of this way of thinking is a carbon tax. So proponents of a carbon tax will say that there is a negative externality associated with carbon-intensive manufacturing, but that negative externality is not reflected in the cost that you pay at retail for any given product. By pricing in carbon to the production process, you make sure that the consumers are paying and covering the cost of the carbon emissions. But for that to make sense, you would then need the revenue to be returned into the same system to mitigate the negative effects of carbon emissions. Now put together 5 principles for excise tax design. These don't touch on all the different aspects of excise tax design, but they're definitely going to be useful to anyone who are analyzing or designing an excise tax. The first of the principles is that economic substitute should not be included in the excise tax base. And what I mean by that is, if you're taxing a product like tobacco, and there's a substitute good available, could be vapor taxes or vapor products. You don't want to include vapor products in your tax base because there's decisible substitution. So if you do include them, it's the same kind of thinking like if you include a diet beverage into a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, right? Then all you're doing is looking for revenue. What an excise tax should do is target the externality. And it doesn't do that if it includes substitute goods into the base. The next principle is that an excise tax should target the negative externality or cost, which means the base should be the best available proxy for externalities or cost. And this is a point we're going to return to a few times today because it's not always straightforward what the best proxy is. So it'll take a little bit of thought for lawmakers to figure out, especially in these new emerging markets where there's not a well-established category. The third principle, specific taxes are superior to ad valorem taxes in most cases because quantity is associated with negative externalities or cost, while a product's price often shares no association. And again, we're seeing, unfortunately, a little bit of a trend, especially with the newer excise tax categories, that states are imposing ad valorem taxes on cannabis, on vapor products, likely because it's simpler. There's a market transaction at retail that is easy to tax. The problem is they miss the negative externality because that's not associated with the price. It doesn't matter if a consumer pays $5 or $10 for a beer, the negative externality is the same. So the tax should be the same. An efficient rate is not the same as a revenue maximizing rate. What I mean here is there's a point. There's a point of a tax rate where if you increase it beyond that, you might not see increasing revenue. You might see a revenue decline because the effect on consumption would be higher than your revenue effect. As I said before, excise taxes are regressive. So an efficient tax rate is not the same as finding that point where you raise the maximum amount of revenue. It might very well be much lower than that. Appropriately leveled tax rates can be indexed to inflation to retain real value of tax level. Now, because we're advocating for a quantity-based tax, it's important to make sure that the value of your tax is not eroded by inflation. So if you have done the legwork and you have a appropriate tax rate on your goods, it makes sense to increase it automatically to follow inflation. I think the best example out there is the federal gas tax, which hasn't been increased for almost 30 years. The value of that is nowhere near what it was when it was imposed. As a final point on this slide, I wanted to put sort of our position on excise tax base rate and revenue into the context of the Tax Foundation principles for sound tax policy. Their neutrality, transparency, simplicity, and stability. And it sort of guides our thinking on excise taxes as well. Now, excise taxes are almost non-neutral by design. They're on specific goods or activities. They're often imposed to deter consumption. But within a category, they should still strive to be as neutral as possible. This is best achieved with a quantity-based tax. As said before, it doesn't matter if a beer costs $5 or $10, the negative externality is the same, and you shouldn't encourage consumption of one over the other, so the tax should be the same. This goes for all categories. Transparency is also best achieved with a quantity-based tax because it's easier for everyone to understand the tax burden if it's based on the quantity. If it's based on price, often built in early in the value chain, it's hard for the taxpayer to understand what they're paying. This point is also really connected to simplicity. It is simpler to levy a tax on quantity. It is easier to calculate. It also allows the tax to be levied earlier in the value chain because you don't need a market transaction to put a value on the product, which is often necessary when we're talking about price-based taxes. These are often levied at retail level or between wholesale and retail because you need a market transaction. This is not needed with a quantity-based tax, which makes it simpler. The last and probably most important point is stability. Quantity-based taxes are more stable because they're not affected by price developments. So I think cannabis is probably the best example we have right now. The prices of cannabis in such a new market that is growing exponentially are going to fluctuate. And if you base your tax on the price, you're going to be affected by these price swings. If you base it on quantity, weight, or potency, you're not going to see the same swings in your revenue generation. It's going to be a lot more stable because quantity sold is a lot more stable than the price. Now, I've already mentioned that the tax burden falls on lower income to a higher degree than it does to the high income. This is true for most consumption taxes. They generally result in higher effective rates for low-income taxpayers. But for certain excise taxes, this effect is made worse because consumption doesn't necessarily follow an increase in ability to pay. So I've included a table here that shows you 4 federal categories and the tax burden paid by each income group. And both with taxes on highway use, motor fuel taxes, on air travel, on alcohol, it generally follows the income distribution, which means the more you make, the more you consume, and the more you pay in taxes. Tobacco is an outlier here. It does still follow the income distribution. It is still true that the top quintile pays more than the lowest quintile, but it's much, much flatter and illustrates how regressive tobacco taxes really are. Now, just because these taxes are regressive doesn't mean you shouldn't levy them. There are still legitimate reasons to levy excise taxes. But it does underline the point that we don't want to rely on these taxes for general revenue. We should rely on them to internalize externalities. And I've heard the point being made before that the regressive effects may actually be a positive, that you actually want to affect people who make the least the most because they often tend to consume more tobacco, they may tend to consume more sugary drinks, and thus the effect of a tax increase would be higher on their consumption patterns. And I think I want to question that assumption because, as you can see, it's already the case that the lowest quintile pays a higher effective rate than the highest quintile, and they still remain the group that consume the most. So I wouldn't rely on that assumption too much. Now let's get into the 3 big categories of excise taxes: alcohol, tobacco, and motor fuel. We'll start with alcohol. Alcohol taxes have a long history in this country. They existed before there even was a country, right? So the first tax on beer was actually levied in New Amsterdam, today's New York, all the way back in the 17th century. And in the US, infamously, George Washington levied a tax on whiskey to pay back war debts from the Revolutionary War. Today, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government levies a tax. Most commonly, this is levied on alcohol by volume, though it does vary from state to state. This is a good base. This is a good tax base because it accounts for the different externalities associated with different levels in potency. What you may try to get at here is intoxication levels and say, the higher the alcohol content, or the more likely a person is to get intoxicated by drinking this product, the higher the tax should be, because the cost associated with this kind of consumption is related to the amount of alcohol consumed. And the question is, I guess, a very basic question: is it legitimate to levy a tax on alcohol? And I think it is. If we consult the CDC, alcohol consumption is one of the leading causes of preventable deaths in the US. The agency also claims that the cost associated with excessive alcohol consumption far outpace the revenue raised by alcohol taxes. But there's an issue using excise taxes on alcohol to account for all this. That's because harm is not linear, it's exponential. If you're a moderate or light drinker, you're almost certainly not incurring any cost on society. If you are a heavy drinker, on the other hand, you almost certainly are. So 10% of the alcohol consumed in the U.S., 50% of the alcohol consumed in the US is consumed by 10% of the drinkers, right? So it's these 10% that are likely incurring most of the cost. And is it legitimate to ask moderate to light drinkers to pay a lot more in taxes to cover the cost of the 10%? That's a good question. Now, if you wanted to use excise taxes as a deterrent to affect these heavy drinkers, I have some bad news. Because if we do increase taxes, which in turn increases prices, it's likely to be the light and moderate drinkers that give up their habit. It's much easier for them. Heavy drinkers are much more unlikely to stop due to excise tax increases. In fact, there was a study done to look at what would happen if we increased the federal excise tax on alcohol. And it found that 83% of a new tax would be paid for by heavy drinkers. The last point I wanted to share with you on alcohol taxes is that revenue is too often allocated to general funds. I think this makes sense from a historical point of view. This has historically been a revenue tool. But today it would make a lot more sense to allocate some of this money to the cost associated with alcohol consumption instead of just stuffing it into the general fund. The next one is tobacco. So again, tax bases differ. Generally, the tax base is quantity. We'll often see cigarettes being taxed by stick, individual cigarette. We'll often see loose tobacco being taxed by weight. But some do use ad valorem taxes on tobacco products as well. Now, not only do bases vary, tax rates vary significantly. On average, a pack of 20 cigarettes is taxed at $1.88 by the states. And there's a federal tax of $1 as well. This variance in tax levels impacts consumer behavior a lot more than any other excise good. So I've included a map here that shows cigarette smuggling by state. And what we can see is that large price discrepancies, which is a result of large tax discrepancies, result in significant inflow and outflow. So states with low taxes that are surrounded by states with high taxes are going to see a lot of outflow. The number one example is New Hampshire, where 66% of the cigarettes sold in New Hampshire are not consumed in New Hampshire. Vice versa, if you have a high tax and you have low tax neighbors, you're going to see a lot of inflow. New York is the number one example here, with over 50% of the cigarettes consumed in New York not taxed by New York. This is a good example of how excise taxes impact behavior. Taxes are high on cigarettes, and they're probably higher than the negative externalities justify. In two states, Minnesota and New York, they make up over 50% of the retail price. Another example of the issues of narrow tax bases is when lawmakers make regulatory decisions that are unrelated to tax policy, but that affect revenue generation. So in June of last year, Massachusetts imposed a flavor ban on tobacco products, including menthol cigarettes. Now, menthol cigarettes is a very popular product. Upwards of one third of the market of cigarettes is menthol cigarettes. So that was going to impact their revenue generation. They knew that going in. They estimated about $93 million decline for the first full fiscal year. The issue has been up there that, yes, revenue has declined, sales has declined. Sales declined over 20% in the first 6 months, which is the equivalent of about $60 million. But consumption didn't disappear. So every single pack that wasn't sold in Massachusetts was sold in New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Vermont and New York. In fact, New Hampshire sales went up 34%. Rhode Island sales went up 25%. So it's telling you the same story as the cigarette smuggling, which is a result of price discrepancies, that it's very hard to achieve this impact on behavior through the tax code if there's available substitute goods close by. And in Massachusetts, the result ended up being that they lost over 20% of their sales. They didn't impact the negative externalities or costs because consumption is going on still. It's basically just sending tax revenue across their state borders to their neighbors without any public health benefit. The last of the three big taxes is the motor fuel tax. Another old one. At the federal level, this tax has been levied since 1932. The first levy was 1 cent per gallon. As with the other excise taxes, traditionally a revenue tool. It was imposed originally following the Great Depression to cut deficits. It was then increased during World War II, again during the Korean War to pay down war debts. And then finally in 1956, the Highway Fund was established. And the rate was 3 cents back then. Since it has increased 5 times to 18.4 cents per gallon today. At the state level, the tax is over 100 years old. It's been levied since 1919 in some states, and it's been levied by all states since 1946. Today, the average rate is 25.6 cents per gallon. But if we include other taxes levied on motor fuel or on gasoline, the average rate is 34.6 cents per gallon. Now, the base is a good base, and it has been a good base. Using gasoline and diesel consumption as a proxy for road use makes sense. The more gasoline, the more diesel you consume, the more likely you are to utilize the highway system. But there are some issues. There's some issues emerging. I think it's a good example of what the risk is with narrow-based taxation. Because first, the federal rate has not been indexed to inflation. It is worth almost half today what it was in 1993 when it was first levied. And second, cars today, vehicles today, have much better fuel economy, and they get many more miles per gallon than they did back in 1993. So not only has the value been eroded by inflation, it's also challenged by technological development. So if you drive today, you're paying much less per mile than you were in 1993. The second challenge to the motor fuel tax is the growth of electric vehicles, growth of the sales of electric vehicles, rather. These don't consume any gasoline at all, and as such, don't contribute at all to the highway system. And these are not problems that are likely to disappear or to become less important in the coming years. So it may be time, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but sooner rather than later, for lawmakers to consider how to make motor fuel taxation or how to make infrastructure taxation sustainable for the coming decades. Because currently, and that's the map I include here on the right, only a few states, I think it's 3 states, raise enough revenue on their current taxes to pay for their infrastructure spending. All the rest of them have to backfill with general fund revenue to make up the difference. That issue is going to get worse as cars get more miles to the gallon, as more electric vehicles get on the road. One option to solve this issue could be to impose a vehicle miles traveled tax. Now, this particular tax does have significant issues. I mean, there's privacy concerns. A lot of taxpayers don't want to be tracked and tell a revenue department exactly how much they're driving or where they're driving. But there may be ways around it. And at the very least, commercial vehicles who are responsible for most of the damage done to roads and who are already tracked could be rolled into a vehicle miles travel tax system to get this system up and running, and maybe eventually include private vehicles as well. A last point to this tax is, even though it's only 3 states that raise enough revenue to pay for their cost, 25 states actually divert revenue away from their motor fuel taxes to completely unrelated spending programs. So in the short term, these states should at the very least repurpose that revenue back into infrastructure spending and stop the practice of diverting it away from unrelated spending. Because this whole what is supposed to be a closed loop user fee system dictates that the tax is legitimate because it pays for the roads, it should actually do that. Now, on to the trends. And recreational marijuana taxes or cannabis taxes. This is a popular issue right now. We have 15 states that currently allow and tax the sale of cannabis. We have, I think my latest count was 15 states that are actively considering it this session. And it makes sense. There's a potentially very profitable market that is enticing. You can levy new taxes, you can make up new revenue, you convert what was previously illicit, illegal behavior into legal and licensed stores and consumption that can be taxed. I mean, we don't take a position on whether a state should legalize or not, or whether the federal government should legalize or not. But we are very concerned with how taxes are designed on cannabis. And I've come up with 3 guiding principles for how states should think about taxing these products. The first is the tax rate should be low enough to allow legal markets to undercut or at least gain price parity with the illicit market. And I think this should be the first and most important point, because if you're going to establish a licensed legal market, you're doing it to convert what was previously illegal behavior into legal behavior. And to be successful there, you have to encourage consumers and businesses to switch. This is not done by levying a tax that would make it difficult for them to compete with the illegal market. You should levy a tax that is low enough to allow them to compete, because then consumers will make the switch and businesses will make the switch. The next principle is that taxes should be designed to offer stable revenue in the short term, regardless of potential price declines. Cannabis is an interesting case because the second you legalize, you're going to have very little supply and likely pretty high demand. That's going to result in really high prices. Now, as that supply increases over time, your retail prices are going to decline. So if you're levying a tax based on price, your revenue per ounce sold will decline. Now, what we've seen is you can't really see this decline in total revenues because the market is growing so quickly that revenue increases nonetheless. But if we levy this tax because we assume there is a negative externality or harm associated with consumption, that's related to the quantity consumed. And a price-based tax would very quickly raise less revenue per ounce sold than a quantity-based tax. Now, most states have decided to levy a price-based tax. In fact, only 1 state levies a specific tax. That's Alaska. They levy a tax based on weight. 10 states levy taxes based on price. And then there are 4 states that have mixed systems. It's understandable that states have sort of defaulted on a price-based system. The cannabis market is complex, it's ever changing and developing. But we really encourage that you don't punt the question down the road and revert to simple ad valorem taxes, because you're not actually capturing the externality. When you levy an ad valorem tax, it looks more like you're trying to capture the economic activity. And that's not the job of the excise tax. The excise tax is there to internalize the externality. We have other taxes that are whose job it is to capture economic activity. That be your income taxes, your sales taxes. And they should be left to do their job, while the excise tax should be there to internalize the externalities. And it's a complicated question. How do we do that best? Because there's so much we don't know about the negative effects of consuming cannabis. There are no real good studies on long-term effects of THC consumption. We don't know the difference between consuming a low potency product and a high potency product. So how do you best design a tax base that captures this negative externality? I think the easiest thing to do at this point in time is to consider the different product categories into two, to split them into two. You have your smokable product, that'd be your flower products that are sold to be smoked. And you have your infused products such as edibles, concentrates, oils, and the like. Smokable products are very hard to test for THC content because it is plant material. So depending on where you make your little cut or incision on the leaf, you can get wildly different results. So potency tax on plant material, it's going to be complicated. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying it's going to be complicated. Easier is to tax the smokable products on weight, similar to how we tax tobacco. Basically saying the smokable product is more similar to a tobacco product, which we tax on weight, quantity, and that's the best proxy for the harm caused by smoking cannabis. The other products, whether it be infused candy, infused baked goods, whether it be oils or concentrates, they're distinguished by their THC content, right? So a chocolate bar with THC, the manufacturer will extract THC oil from the plant and infuse it into the chocolate. So we know exactly how much THC is in that product. And we can levy a tax directly on the milligrams of THC, more similar to how we do alcohol taxes. And the externalities are probably also more similar to how alcohol affects you. It's the intoxicants where we're looking to tax. So we're saying the more THC you consume, the higher the cost associated because you're going to be more intoxicated. So we're going to tax that product based on THC. Whether that's the tax system that will work forever, I don't know. But I think at this point in time, with the information we have, this is probably the best way to go. And then there's the big if when it comes to cannabis taxes. The big if is, what if the federal government decides to deschedule cannabis and legalizes interstate competition? Well, if you have a price-based tax and interstate competition becomes legal, you're likely to have some issues. And that's because the entire demand for cannabis could probably be fulfilled by 1, maybe 2 states. And economies of scale dictate that prices will decline significantly. So if you're relying on retail price for your tax revenue, you might be in for a rude awakening. Now, if you're relying on quantity, your tax revenue is much more likely to be stable. Further, if the federal government does deschedule and interstate commerce becomes legal, which it isn't today, I forgot to mention that under current law, it is illegal for cannabis material to cross state borders, which means it's sort of from seed to sale must happen within the state. But that could change if the federal government decides to deschedule it. if you're levying a tax on price, by the time the product hits the shelf in your state, the federal excise tax is almost 100% certain to be built into the price, which means that a retail-based price tax at the state level would be a tax not just on price, but a tax on a tax. Now, this may be appropriate if it was a sales tax, but it's not appropriate for the excise tax. The excise tax is there to internalize the externality, not to tax another tax. I've included some revenue estimates for what tax revenue may look like for all 50 states. I think these are helpful to the conversation because, as you can see, only a few states, the very large state, can raise over $1 billion. Most other states were looking at meaningful but not revolutionary revenue. And I think this is something that everyone who are involved in the conversation should remember. You should not legalize cannabis for the purpose of revenue, because the revenue is unlikely to be there. There can be meaningful revenue that can run the system, that can pay for the new regulatory framework, that can be invested into cessation treatment, to drug treatment, and the like. But there's not going to be revenue there that can replace other income streams. That being said, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the states that have legalized have been rather successful. Colorado, Oregon, Washington, to a large extent, their legal market has been able to outcompete the illicit providers. Not completely, that's not going to happen, but to a large extent. I think that's success that should be acknowledged. Now, these figures that I have here they're available in my report called Roadmap to Marijuana Taxation. And they're based on Colorado's collections in their 5th year. So it's also important to remember it's going to take time. If you do legalize cannabis, revenue will not materialize for a while. It's a lot of cost establishing the new system. And it's going to take time for consumers to convert, for businesses to open, for supply to increase before real revenue will be available. The next trend, vapor taxes. So the nicotine market in America changed significantly since I think 2007 is the year where vapor products really made an entry into the market. And states have been slow to develop taxes on these products, but more and more are joining the pack. I think from a pure public health standpoint, it's questionable the rationale for taxing nicotine products or vapor products. And this goes back to what I had mentioned in the beginning about substitute goods. Vapor products are significantly less harmful than combustible tobacco products. So the biggest risk here is that vapor taxes are taxed like tobacco products. That will take away the encouragement for current smokers to substitute to a less harmful product. And it also misses the mark on capturing the externality. If tobacco taxes capture the externality associated with tobacco smoking, vapor taxes should capture the externality associated with vaping, which are going to be much lower. Another issue that we're seeing in a number of states is a price-based tax. Just like cannabis taxes, states have sort of defaulted to a price-based tax. They don't have to develop an intricate system and just rely on market transactions. The same points that I made before goes for this tax. If you want to capture the externality, if you want to capture the harm, you can't rely on price because it's not associated with harm. You gotta levy a tax based on quantity. And a number of states have. The obvious choice for vapor products is going to be milliliters, to levy a small tax per milliliter consumed. Now, vapor products are not the only new nicotine product on the market. There's also nicotine pouches, which are small, non-tobacco containing pouches that their consumer can put in their mouth. These you should levy a tax based on weight. Then there is heated tobacco products, which are tobacco products where there's no combustion. And combustion is responsible for the majority of the negative effects associated with smoking. These products, which are still relatively new, are not available in very many states. But if states do start to think about them, it'd be worth considering what will the definition look like for these, what will the tax rate look like for these. And the best option there is likely to be a weight-based tax. I think when we're talking about vapor taxes, one of the main arguments that is often brought to the forefront is that you need high taxes on these products to deter young people from consuming them. And I think it's one of the examples of don't try and fix the world through the tax code. There are a lot of issues out there that are better tackled by regulation than by taxes. One example is underage vaping. Another example could be smoking in public places. These things should be addressed by regulation rather than taxation. The issue with taxation is you risk harming adult smokers who want to switch to vaping products in this case. But so a very laudable goal of trying to limit youth vaping may have the unintended consequence of keeping more smokers addicted to smoking when there was an option for them to substitute that to a less harmful vaping product. And the concept's normally called harm reduction. It basically states that you want to encourage people to reduce their harm because oftentimes that's the possibility. It's sort of acknowledging that we're not going to eliminate harm. So we should target reduction rather than elimination. Another emerging trend, sports betting taxes. So after the Supreme Court decided in Murphy versus the National Collegiate Athletic Association, states have been able to legalize and tax sports betting. I included this example because it's one of the ones where the ad valorem tax is appropriate, because the best proxy for the harm associated with sports betting is going to be the size of the bet. So ad valorem taxes make perfect sense here. It does share some of the issues that we have for recreational marijuana dispensaries. They're going to be competing against illicit operators. They're going to be competing against operators in other states. So you want to be careful about not levying a tax too high. If you do end up legalizing this kind of activity and taxing it, you're going to want to encourage your industry to actually succeed. And this is best done by having a moderate tax, which most states have done. There are some outliers in monopoly states, but generally taxes on sports betting are fairly low. An interesting concept that we haven't seen in very many other areas of taxes is this so-called integrity fee. So an integrity fee in sports betting is something that the sports leagues have advocated for, basically asking for 1% of the handle. And the handle, when we're talking sports betting, is the amount of money that is being betted. 1% of that paid out to the leagues in integrity fees as a way to guarantee that the data, which sports betting relies on, is accurate. It's very unlikely that there's any real legitimacy to this claim, and almost no states have implemented them. But it's an interesting aspect of sports betting taxes that I wanted to bring up today. And I think sports betting is another industry that's likely to grow significantly over the next few years. I mean, even in 2020, despite the pandemic, despite a lot of sporting events getting canceled, the sports betting industry had a good year. Americans spent over $20 billion betting through 2020. Now, sugar sweetened beverage taxes. This is currently only levied at the local level, but this session, a number of states are considering statewide beverage taxes. So currently there are proposals in, I think, 8 states, my latest count. Now, this is the one tax I have included today that I don't see any legitimacy for. It is normally designed as a revenue raiser. So most localities that levy this tax don't distinguish between high sugar content, low sugar content, and a few states even include diet options in their tax base. This takes away any encouragement on the manufacturers, on the consumers, to move from high sugar beverages to low sugar beverages. It's kind of similar to what we discussed with vapor taxing. You want to make sure that the tax level, tax burden on a product reflects the externalities. And it's very unlikely that a low sugar beverage and high sugar beverage have the same level of externalities. Further, the base is so narrow that it fails to internalize the negative externalities associated with sugar consumption, because we're not really taxing sugar, we're taxing beverages containing sugar, which means it's very, very easy for a consumer to substitute sugar consumption from another product, right? You can switch to candy bars if that's a way to get your craving satisfied. There's even studies out there that indicate consumers switch to beer when you levy a tax on beverages, sugar sweetened beverages. So while these taxes do limit consumption of soda, they increase the price, consumption goes down, and they do raise some revenue, they're very unlikely to have any positive public health effect, because they're not going to actually limit the caloric intake from your consumers. They can just substitute and get their calories from other sources. So with a base that narrow, you're not going to actually internalize the negative externalities. You just ask soda consumers to pay more in taxes. And that's definitely not legitimate. It's kind of like if we were to tax tobacco and cigarettes, but not tobacco and cigars, or alcohol and wine, but not alcohol and beer. The base is simply too narrow. And then the question is, well, why don't we just widen the base to include all sugar? So as I mentioned, the base on sugar sweetened beverages is simply too narrow to actually internalize the negative externalities associated with sugar consumption, right? Because you're not really taxing sugar, you're taxing beverages with sugar, which means it's too easy for consumers to simply substitute to another good that has sugar in it, whether that be candy bars or candy or something else that's sugary, or even a completely different product. I mean, studies show that consumers may even switch to alcoholic beverages like beer when you levy a tax on soda. This base is too narrow to be effective in what it's setting out to do. And further, even if you expanded the base to include all sugar, you'd run into some serious issues. Taxing all sugar in all foods would be overly complex. And we have examples at the international level. In my home country of Denmark, there was a fat tax levied a few years back, which tried to internalize the externalities associated with trans fats added to food. And it was abandoned after just a few years because it turned out to be very regressive, very expensive to collect, and very expensive for businesses to comply with. And a sugar tax would almost certainly have the same issues. What we've seen in the localities that do levy it is consumption does go down. There is some revenue raised, but there's no positive effect on public health because it's too easy for consumers to get their craving satisfied through substitute goods. And this was the last of the tax categories I wanted to walk through today. I really want to thank you guys for paying attention, spending your Tuesday morning with me as I discuss different excise tax categories, both well-established and emerging, because the excise tax world or family is growing. There's going to be more. There's going to be new categories, and some of the old ones may disappear. As I mentioned, the motor fuel tax may eventually become so inefficient in raising revenue that you need to redesign it. And other products such as single-use plastics, spring water, ride-hailing are some of the categories that lawmakers are considering to tax. Now, I think one important point that I want to bring up is everything you do has externalities, and we shouldn't try to account for every single one of them through our tax code. All common consumption has negative externalities. The tax code will not be able to correct all of that. So excise taxes should be levied with caution. And to round off here, I think it's just important to remember that excise taxes should not be imposed to raise general fund revenue. They're not going to deliver stable revenue, and you don't want to be relying on an unstable source of revenue for your recurring cost associated with important spending programs that you may have in your state. And then a final point. We've discussed excise taxes today and their impact on behavior, and they do have an impact on behavior. When you levy a tax, you're gonna change the way people behave and consume. I just want to encourage everyone to acknowledge that there's a similar impact on other taxes, right? So when we levy a tax on income, people are going to adjust their behavior, just like they will with excise taxes. And then I want to remind you all that this was our 4th out of 6 total state boot camps. Next session will be on emerging issues of state taxation. So we'll go over wealth taxes, digital advertising taxes, and the like, and they'll be led by Jared Walzak. So I hope you'll tune back in on Tuesday at 10 a.m. For that session. And then if any of you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me at uboesen, which is UBOESEN @taxfoundation.org. And you'll be able to find the presentation that I gave today, along with the recording and any material on taxfoundation.org/bootcamp, all in one word. That was taxfoundation.org/bootcamp. Thank you very much for tuning in.